What is the difference between secondary sources and primary sources? Well, secondary sources are things like books, documentaries, news stories, movies, plays, songs, articles, even podcasts, which serve to inform their audience about a subject. Primary sources, on the other hand, come directly from the subject, and they come in all shapes and sizes. In fact, those same examples of secondary sources, in this podcast view anyway, are perfectly good primary sources. After all, everything is a primary source, even motels. I was delighted to be joined recently by Rolando Pujol to discuss and dissect two 20th century documents of American road culture, Howard Johnson's and Holiday Inn. And while I promote listening to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast in any setting, I have to say that this episode is absolutely perfect listening for driving down the highway.
Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and today I'm excited to have on my show the Retrologist, Rolando Pujol, who is joining me from New York City, correct?
Correct.
And
Yes.
this is your home base of operations, but as if anybody follows the Instagram account, the Retrologist, which I do, it's all about the highways and byways of America and the things that we find on the side of the road. And thank you so much. It wasn't that long ago I contacted you. I said, "Do you do podcasts?"
Yeah.
And I felt like mine, where everything is dissected as a product of its time period, and yours go hand in hand. So thank you for joining.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. I love your approach to pop culture and how universal you are in what you want to examine. So certainly, things like Howard Johnson's would fit neatly next to that. So.
And so this is your side hustle. You were saying this is kind of like your secondary thing, and your full work day. You're at ABC7 in New York, the executive producer.
Right. That's right. I'm an EP there. I help oversee digital and premium content and help guide the station strategically in not only the digital space, but in all that we do. Because as you know, linear television industry is changing rapidly as we speak. It's been going on for years, and now with the growth in streaming, it's a very exciting and interesting space. And so that's what I do. That's my day job, and it's also my night job. It's a very demanding, 24/7 kind of job. But the way that I also find, and it's a great creative release for me, but I also deeply enjoy what you were talking about, which is what I post on my Instagram under my account handle, which is just my name, Rolando Pujol, and I've been there for about a decade on Instagram, but it really began to approach the work there with much more intentionality and passion and excitement, I would say about 3 or 4 years ago. And as it continued to find an audience, connect with people, making all kinds of friendships around the country, people who care about the same thing. And that sort of encouraged me as I began to grow there and connect with people from all walks of life. And the account's sort of like taken off. It's got over 90,000 followers. There are weeks where my posts reach millions of people. It's really incredibly exciting. So when you have an audience of that size, you feel a certain dedication to it. You feel a certain desire to really serve it. And so that's really, in addition to my core job that pays the bills, what pays the sort of the emotional bills, what really brings me great emotional and intellectual sustenance is sort of what I do on Instagram and now on a newsletter as well on Substack that I recently launched, and maybe a book at some point. I've been playing with a possible pitch to a publisher, but that's still sort of in the early stages, but we'll see. So.
Well, if such a book were to come out, it'd be perfect, because I mean, I could see it as like a great coffee table book, maybe not like Kramer's that would have actual feet on it, but so colorful. I mean, it's like, that's what attracted me to the Instagram thing. You know, it came up like suggested to me by Instagram, and
Oh, interesting.
you know, something about, for the most part, like pictures of old ponderosas aren't exactly as colorful, but you know, the big bright, you know, like the primary colors being just
Yeah.
so vibrant from the mid-century roadsides, and it's super appealing. And like you said, it's almost like each one of them has its own story. It has its own, you know, local appeal, and I think that's why people across the country, like I was cycling through your previous posts, and I stopped in my tracks when I saw Yokin's, you know,
Oh,
the restaurant. I used to go to
yeah.
that restaurant when I was a kid.
Wow.
It was still open back then, and you know the whale, you know, the light up,
Mhm.
you
Beautiful
know,
whale.
here in New Hampshire, and I don't know if they ever took down that sign, but they definitely relit it up a couple years ago, and
Yep.
it's so you can, and it is coincidentally is a Five Guys where it used to be.
That's
So
right.
you're driving past it, and it's like, oh, there's where Yokin's, this very unique and authentic restaurant, you know, used to be, and then you know a chain is taking its place.
I
But
remember that day very well when I went up there because I had never been to Yokin's. It was on my list. I had some time off, and I just basically set off and said, "I'm on my way to New Hampshire. I'm just going to go. Let's do
yeah,
this," you know. And like 5 hours later, I was sitting in front of Yokin's, you know,
there it
or the
is.
sign, I should say. So,
And if you were to go a little bit further up Lafayette Road,
mhm.
Route 1 into the Portsmouth traffic circle, you would see examples of the two things that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah,
There's a Howard Johnson's right there
yeah,
on the famous Portsmouth traffic circle, as well as a Holiday Inn.
yep.
And so today's um, topic is going to be what we're going to dissect is those two places. And I mean, one of them, Holiday Inn, has a history that dates back only to 1953, and then Howard Johnson's has 1920s as the restaurant. And then, so what I would like to do is, I think that looking at Howard Johnson's when the restaurant and the Motor Lodge merged again in like the early 50s would be kind of our place to break it down and how that's a product of its time, if that
Yeah.
works for you.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So Howard Johnson's from the very, very beginning was something that, I mean, taking a step back, we can start with Howard Deering Johnson himself, the founder of Hojo's. And he was somebody who was a real visionary. He's somebody who took over his dad's tobacco store, and that ended up closing. He assumed all these very big debts. He had a lot of responsibilities to his mother. He had sisters, and he had a wife and soon a family. But he was a visionary, and so he took over a drugstore in Walston. In Massachusetts, and the centerpiece of that business, he quickly figured out, was the marble soda counter. You know, I mean, that was the action, and the ice cream that he would eventually sell there. He eventually hit upon a recipe that doubled the butter fat, and it was absolutely just scrumptious, and it led to tremendous demand for this product, not only at that original drugstore, patent medicine drugstore in Quincy, but then also he opened up Shacks on the Beach, also in Massachusetts, a proper Howard Johnson's restaurant in 1929 downtown. And in Quincy, and then in 1935, he basically hit upon the concept, although there had been other examples, but he hit upon it, and most prominently, the concept of franchising.
Mhm.
And he was able to. He had a friend, Reginald Sprague, and who had a good piece of property in Orleans, which is, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in Cape Cod, and it was at a good central location, and it is there that he opened up his first franchised Howard Johnson. And the company grew pretty quickly, hit some headwinds at the start of World War II, when there was gas rationing and a curtailment of supplies, and basically the whole culture was focused around the war effort. So unfortunately for Howard Johnson's, many of the locations that had opened closed. I think only 12 or so survived. And but after the war, again, Howard Deering Johnson, an incredibly innovative, smart, and passionate man, got right back to it. And the company kept growing and growing pretty rapidly. And by the early 50s, again, with the advent of the motor vehicle, it had been around obviously for decades, but more and more post-war, Americans are traveling by car, and vacations are road trips. Traveling by plane is not yet this thing that it would become in the 60s and 70s. So vacation going down Florida meant getting on the highway. And he made sure that Hojo's and that iconic orange roof and the turquoise cupola, the Simple Simon and the Pie Man, Weather Vane, that they were in prominent locations along the highways. He also very intelligently got the concession licenses for Hojo's at major turnpikes, Pennsylvania Turnpike, New Jersey Turnpike, when there were really no other options for travelers but that Hojo's. Right. I mean, now we think about service plazas on turnpikes, and those have a diversity of options. There's like 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 different brands. Back then it was just Hojo's. So really he built his own whole company on the back of the automobile and on families. Hojo's was really innovative in that sense. It really made it understood that to appeal to the traveler, you had to also appeal to families. And of course, traveling at the time could be a very, very dicey proposition. I mean, you didn't know what you were going to get at the diners and restaurants that you encountered along the way. And that problem also extended to where you spent the night. You might have a good lead on a good place to stay, but you never knew what you were going to get. And it was sort of a problem that Howard Johnson tried to fix in the early 50s, starting in early 1954, when he experimented with a motor lodge in Savannah, Georgia. On 17, and that was a big smashing success, and soon there were others that began to open. And this, as you say, is happening around the same time that Holiday Inn, Kevin Wilson, is getting his chain of hotels open, motels open as well, and he is trying to solve the same problem. There is this sea of people out there who are traveling, who are seeing the USA and their Chevrolet, right? Yeah. And they need a safe, reliable, clean place to stay. And they both create like welcoming, warm, appealing, modern environments that are very, very welcoming to people in the 50s through the 70s and 80s. And that's around the time when the problems begin, when properties start to get a little bit haggard. But yes, they're both launching at the same time and responding to trying to solve the same problem in the American traveler.
And it really says something. And thank you, by the way, for that incredible summary of both all at the same time. I mean, it's like it's. And that's why I'm glad I turned to you for this, because this is just perfect. It says a lot about the population of the country, the common man, the ordinary person, where prior generations of working people and the emerging middle class, even as late as the 1890s, didn't have that problem to solve of, all right, where are we going to go on vacation? Because they didn't have that option. It wasn't not until the automobile that they that vacationing became so democratized, where it's like everybody can have a vacation. It might not be the same one, but it's going to be, a similar vacation. When I was in graduate school, I took two different semesters, same professor, fantastic professor, who was actually a guest on my show last season, Gwen Kay. And she had one class about American foodways, and then another class that I took with her was about American leisure and recreation. And sometimes I confuse what I did for both, but for each, I mean, and it's my thesis. But I believe for the roadway or the foodways one, I focused on fast food franchise fast food and its correlation with the highways, particularly the interstates. And then for the other one, it was about I was more specific about the tourism and leisure of way upstate New York, up near Plattsburgh, New York on Lake Champlain, using there's a old one of those railway hotels at the top of it's a community college now, but it was called Hotel Champlain, and it was at the top of a big bluff point, and and then at the bottom of the hill was a Catholic summer school called Cliff Haven, and it's actually it's a neighborhood now, and and has been for a while, and the houses there are very 60s 70s, like that's when they were all built. And because nobody that went to those places to vacation were middle class people, like, or if they were like the middle class that you see in Meet Me in St. Louis, like when they say in that movie, like, oh well, we're just a middle class family, and they have this sprawling lawn with a gigantic house, and there's like 11 kids in the family, and you're like, really, like that's middle class? I always thought that was more like upper. But like the 9 to 5 commuter type job, they didn't have vacation the same way as the upper classes did until the automobile showed up. And so it's like with Howard Johnson's, with him opening up options for food along the turnpikes, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. It's very much a reflection of that post World War I boom, where you have, there's no GI Bill yet, but there's still, veterans who come back. The economy is doing great. The United States is the only world power that emerges unscathed by the war as far as the actual infrastructure. If anything, it's stronger than before the war. And by the end of that decade, you have the U.S. highway system with Route 1, and then going north south, and then all the way out to so a network of for that time period anyway, pretty nice open road. And then with the Second World War, you have the interstate highways, and I think a lot of times people tend to think of, and rightly so, Eisenhower is the one who signed that into legislation as the Interstate Highway Act, giving money for all the states to have, to keep those roads going. But those were already underway, like like you said, in the 30s, they were already coming together. Like states were recognizing the problems that were happening by having too much congestion of cars in their cities, or needing to allow people to live in the suburbs and get to the city for work every day. And so they were widening the roads 2 to 4 lanes, on each side, and all of that. And my understanding, I mean, I guess the short version of it is, after World War II, and Eisenhower was the the governor basically, or the occupation leader for the Allies, or the American sector of Germany, and even during the war, marveled at how the Autobahn allowed for the Germans to move their military back and forth across the country with relative ease. And that, of course, by nowadays the Autobahn has almost like, especially for new drivers, young people, like, you can go as fast as you want. Like, there's no speed limit on the Autobahn.
That's the funny thing. You mentioned Autobahn. The first thing I always think of, wow, I could drive at any speed. I have a Volkswagen Passat, and that 160 mile per hour upper limit, I'm never going to be able to test it here.
Right.
But I could there. So
my parents visited Germany, I think in the 70s, and they drove on the Autobahn, but they had some rental that maxed out at like 50 or 60.
Oh, no.
So it was totally wasted on them. They're like, oh, come on. But I want to bring them up in this because I've only been to Howard Johnson's twice in my life. Once was in the Times Square location. And it was like, because my mom is from the greater New York area. She's from Mount Vernon. So, we would, whenever we visited grandma, we'd go to the city. And I remember, I'm like, where are we going for lunch? Like, what is this place? She's like, Hojo's, just kind of said it like,
Hojo's, yeah.
of course, like why, and it was funny walking into the place because, it, you have New York City right behind you, but as soon as you walk into Howard Johnson's, it's like, oh, this looks like any other. It could be pretty much anywhere else. I mean, I think it had 2 floors to it, but it was still like, that. And then the other one was in Plattsburgh, New York, which is on the clear other side of I-89, right near the Canadian border. And actually, I got a kick out of it probably about 10, 15 years ago because there's an episode of Mad Men where they send the Don Draper up to Plattsburgh to visit that same Howard Johnson's because they're going to do some kind of marketing campaign for them.
Yeah, they're gonna start working with Howard Johnson. He's like doing some recon.
Right, exactly. And so I mean, it wasn't the actual place, but I was like, hey, I've been to that one. And I didn't realize it until just like today when I was looking into it, that there's a reason why there was a ground round right next door because they opened. And I remember going to that ground round so I guess technically I've been to 3 Howard Johnsons.
That's right.
And I was like, this place is fantastic because I was like 10 and they had, the meeting of both worlds. They had regular food and, but they had big screen TVs with Scooby-Doo on and they had like the video games by the door.
In the old-timey movies and the kind of atmosphere. And clearly the two of us, neither of us has a peanut allergy because
like, here you go.
round if it's so funny today with concern around allergies to imagine a restaurant whose one of whose core tenets is chucking peanuts everywhere.
Right. I remember popcorn too. They like had all you could eat popcorn, because it was and it seems like that. So Howard Johnson's in particular, between the two, really embraced the looking ahead, trying to find the next big thing, trying to, like you said, cater to families, not to business people on the move or anything like that. Whereas Holiday Inn seems to kind of be what's the purpose of your visit, and business or pleasure. And I think even the last time I stayed in one, which probably wasn't that long ago, they had one of those emails that you get afterwards, like, how was your visit, what were you here for? And they had that as the same option. So when it comes to, because in your fantastic summary, I have the breakdown of what I do for primary sources up, and we hit on pretty much all of them as far as who made it, what their status in society was. When it, for Howard Deering Johnson, his status by the time that we get to the 50s is tycoon, basically, right? Wouldn't you say that he's pretty much recognized as?
My goodness, I mean, by the late 30s, he's purchased a like an old money Boston Brahmin estate in Milton, Massachusetts. I mean, this guy is rolling in the dough, easily one of the most successful business people of the 20th century by far. Yeah,
and it's all about his ability to look at what's coming next, what's coming down, down the pike,
that's right.
Literally, as far as the next big thing, because we kind of take the road for granted, don't we? We kind of expect this, especially as Americans. I traveled cross country last summer, and I've mentioned a few of my podcasts. In fact, that's kind of what got me interested in a lot of the places I've reached out to do these shows. Like we traveled from New Hampshire all the way to the Grand Canyon, and
epic trip. Congrats on that. Wow.
I was the whole time there, I'm like, we're still doing this. Oh my God, we're still doing this. I can't believe we're doing this.
Awesome.
And we got all the way out there, and I'm like, okay, now we just got to get back. And most of it was done by interstate highway. And I remember just thinking about it from I forget which, it was probably Cronkite, I think, has the quote of the interstates allow Americans to see to travel the country without seeing a thing.
Yeah,
because they were not built for sightseeing. It wasn't like the U.S. routes where not that those largest ball of twine was actually existing and just waiting for a road to be built next to it. No, but because it was a slower speed, it was 1-2 lane highways at most going on each side, going up and down the country between the two wars. you could have roadside attractions. You could have a little, small size, maybe regional franchise kind of thing going on. But what I was recognizing as we're going down the interstates, I didn't once think for a minute that I was like, yeah, we're going to get stuck and we'll be starving for hours. No, there's going to be a rest stop. There's going to be exit coming up. It's going to have the same stuff. I know it's safe ish. It's like, I did try some regional type fast food places along the way, and I'll leave their names out of it right now because not all of them really. Some of them I was like, oh, what was the big deal about that? But there was when it came time, we got blown off off our path pretty quick. Actually, it wasn't like day 3 or 4. This huge storm showed up, and as we're going through Missouri, I'm like, oh, we can't press on to Kansas tonight, so we had to divert. And it really reminded me of um I'll save that thought for a minute. I'll just finish this thought. But as we're going, I was like, okay, we got a hotel. I think it was like a Best Western, and it's like, boom, good. I don't need to worry. I'm not like, what
Right.
is,
You're
Molly's
not in a
roadside
panic
inn.
about what your options are.
Exactly.
And it's funny. I did a trip with a good friend of mine, Yanis Coretta, who she runs a pretty good Instagram account too, called Hopeless Nostalgic on the same kind of stuff. We were traveling through Oregon, and we ran into some difficulties. We stayed somewhere. We were in an area that was fairly remote. And then we ran across a prescribed burn that seemed to be a little bit out of control. So we had some difficulties. We were just basically not finding any place to stay. And we were briefly for about an hour. I was getting late in an area that we weren't familiar with, sketchy internet service. We were in a momentary panic about where are we going to stay and where are we going to eat. And that place looked sketchy. And oh my God, there's no gas station for another 50 miles. And that gave us unintentionally a little taste of what you're talking about, which is that fear, that primal fear that travelers used to have. Like, oh, that's all well and good, but it's a little scary to go out there on the road. So.
And all it takes is a slight diversion off the interstate, because all those, one of a kind motels, to put it nicely, are on the U.S. routes. Those are the ones that it's going to be locally owned. It's the only one that exists. That's what you're going to find on what is it out west? Is it that goes along the West Coast? It's not.
PCH. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the Pacific Highway, those are going to have like the little cabins or something like that.
That's right.
They're not going to have more than likely a Holiday Inn or a Howard Johnson that you can say, oh, there it is. There's the lamp.
There was never a big towering great sign in Big Sur. That was never allowed.
I also can't help. So, looking at the time period of the 30s for Howard Johnson's, at least, I think about one of my favorite travel movies. I love travel movies, but one of my favorite is It Happened One Night. And when they're, Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert are traveling from Miami all the way to New York by bus. And I think it's like in the first night or the second night of the journey, they get to a bridge and the cops are there and they're like, oh, bridge washed out. And they're like, oh, okay. They're just like, because that was I guess, kind of normal thing in the early days of roadways. Like they didn't have, there's like, all right, well, there's a camp over there that you can get, and you can put yourself up for the night. And that's where they have, one of the funniest scenes of the movies when they're getting ready for bed and he's, taking off his shirt and she, all that stuff. But I always think about that movie, but that part in particular, where it's just like, that was the reality before we get to these super serious, federally funded super highways that allow for people to not even think twice about it. It would be the strangest thing if you're driving down I-95 and you saw a big sign that said like washed out bridge ahead. And I remember like maybe 10 years ago, there was a bridge off of I-95 in Wilmington, Delaware, that was going to be closed for repairs. It was showing signs of wear and they needed to fix it. And they had, there was signs as far north as Maine and all the way down to Miami saying, just because that's the truckers have used that.
And your GPS was certainly not going to send you that way, So, right, we have so many tools at our disposal now that it's very hard to get caught up in that kind of situation unless you have, like, for example, the misfortune of what happened the first week of January earlier this year, where there was a freak kind of ice/snowstorm that paralyzed a good chunk of I-95 corridor in an area that had been in the 70s just a couple of days earlier. I almost got caught up in that, but left a day earlier just to avoid that mess. So the highways, they can still be it can still be dangerous, but you have to really you have to do your homework sometimes.
And I think that's probably what inspired. And I know we're kind of bouncing back and forth between the two hotels and the time periods, but that's fine with me because a place like that, once it's established, it not only is a product of its time, but then it informs the next era in its own way. And so with Holiday Inn, when they created, long before the internet, they had their network of communication between hotels. You could book in advance, and the expectation was you didn't have to do your research. Is this a Roach Motel? Is it's like Holiday Inn. It's going to be, it's not going to be the Ritz. It's not going to be the Plaza, but it's going to be a nice, clean, comfortable room. You can lay your head down and
very fancy holodeck system. So
yes, that's
very,
the one.
very sophisticated. And Hojo's had a similar system as well, that you could, use this fancy telephone in the gatehouse and make a reservation anywhere around the country that they had a motor lodge. Yeah.
Between the two, who would you say gets the credit for most? I don't want to say garish, but like kind of. All right, I'll say garish facade. I mean, I think the Holiday Inn sign, that one's actually pretty charming. But the Howard Johnson's roof, and it's funny that the church that I grew up going to in way upstate North Country, New York, we used to joke because I think it was built in the 50s or the 60s, and I swear to goodness, it's the same cupola, it's the same steeple that it has that like space agey kind of look to it. And I'm like, the first time we ever went to it, we're like, are we going to a Howard Johnson's? Like what's the deal? It almost has a church-like look to it, but
what's funny, when I was a kid, we had two Hojos near me. There was one on Broadway. I grew up in Sleepy Hollow in Terrytown, so Hudson Valley. There was a Hojo's restaurant that was owned by the company on Broadway. And then there was another one that was attached to a motor lodge that was a franchise that was nearby in Elmsford. And to get to Elmsford, we would sometimes take 287. And when you were driving on the interstate, you would pass what we used to call the UFO church, which was just like the one that you're talking about. It had sort of like a very modernistic architectural style, a spire. It was and I too would connect it to Howard Johnson's and their spire, and they're fairly modernist buildings. The roofless Nims low slung design, with the plate glass windows and the inside being brought outside, very, very stylish and modern. And on the way to that Elmsford Hojo's, you would pass that church, So I too would sort of make those connections, which is funny, but in terms of, to answer your question about which was more garish and which was more like over the top, they both had their, eccentricities, I mean, I would say that Howard Johnson's was really innovative in how he understood from the very beginning that he needed design program. I mean, he needed, and if he was going to have consistency and guarantee the same experience food-wise, environment-wise, at every single one of his restaurants and later motor lodges, there had to be real thought given to architecture and design, and logos and colors, and the uniforms of the wait staff. Yeah. And he spent big money on doing this, hiring really, really good people. The designer John Alcott, who sort of came up with Simple Simon and the Pie Man and the Drooling Dog. He's also credited, or so I've read, with the idea of using the bold colors of orange and turquoise, which of course was very smart because, I mean, that roof line coupled with those colors, I mean, that's automatically, that's an advertisement right there.
Right.
You don't have to worry about billboards. You don't have to worry about, I mean, you just see it and you know exactly what you're getting. And for Holiday Inn, although the buildings could be fairly stylish too, it was really that sign that really made the difference. And not to say that Hojo's didn't have fantastic signage, it did. But when you think about great signs, there's a reason why they call it the Great Sign.
Right.
So, and there was a Howard Johnson's Howard Holiday Inn not far from that Howard Johnson Motor Lodge, right there on Route 119 where I grew up. In Westchester, and one had the Great Sign, the other one had the Hojo sign, and it was like for a little impressionable kid, I mean, the backseat of his parents' station wagon. I mean, that really, I think, helped shape my tastes and my interests, and sort of what, as an adult, my continued fascination with that. I mean, that Great Sign was extraordinary, and what was quite extraordinary about it, that at the same time that in the 1980s, Hojo's really began to run into some difficulties and restaurants began to close. You also saw that Great Sign, which had been everywhere, the Great Sign of the American Road, suddenly vanish.
The United States has always had a road culture. We are a society constantly on the move, after all. As such, there has always been an innkeeping industry. In some ways, road hospitality has gone unchanged since the days of colonial taverns offering beds, food, and news to stagecoach passengers, as those same things continue to be sought after when people are lodging. But the revolution in long-distance travel that was prompted by automobiles likewise made for alterations to what travelers could look for when weariness set in. Howard Johnson's is a product of the road and travel culture that came with the post-World War I period, marked with the creation of the U.S. highway system by the end of the 1920s. Holiday Inn came about due to a similar, albeit more robust, touring and vacationing society that came about after World War II, this time denoted by the enhancement of the highways with the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard thus far. If you'd like to listen to the second half of our conversation, please visit patreon.com/EPS podcast. There you can sign up to become a patron and have early access to content. Don't worry, the full episode will be released soon, but Patreon patrons will get a head start on it.